In 1986, 8 of the most powerful men in New York City sat behind a defense table in a federal courtroom, and when the jury foreman read the verdict, every single one of them was found guilty on every single count: racketeering, extortion, labor fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The case was called the Mafia Commission Trial, prosecuted by a young Rudolph Giuliani in the Southern District of New York, and it exposed for the first time in open court the entire financial architecture of the American Cosa Nostra. But the real question was never whether these men were guilty. The real question was how an underground criminal fraternity, built by Sicilian immigrants in the early 20th century, managed to construct a shadow economy worth tens of billions of dollars, one so deeply embedded in legitimate American industry that ripping it out would take decades and still leave scars. To understand how the Mafia made its money, you have to go back to the beginning, and the beginning is not some glamorous penthouse or a smoke-filled social club. The beginning is a lemon grove. In the mid-1800s, the citrus orchards outside Palermo, Sicily, were among the most valuable agricultural assets in Europe. Wealthy landowners needed protection for their crops, and local strongmen, gabellati they were called, offered exactly that for a price. These men didn't just guard the orchards. They controlled water rights. They decided who could sell fruit at market and who couldn't. They taxed commerce without any legal authority to do so. This was the original business model: insert yourself between a legitimate economy and the people who depend on it, then charge a toll for passage. That model would prove infinitely scalable. When millions of Sicilians and Southern Italians emigrated to the United States between 1880 and 1920, a small minority carried this tradition with them. They settled in neighborhoods like East Harlem, the Lower East Side, and South Philadelphia, and almost immediately the toll collecting began. Small Italian-owned businesses, bakeries, barbershops, ice distributors, were approached for weekly payments. The language was always the same. You pay us, and nothing happens to you. You don't pay, and something does. This was the pizzo, the protection racket, and it was the Mafia's first and most enduring revenue stream in America. It didn't require infrastructure or capital investment. It required only violence, reputation, and ethnic insularity. The Italian immigrant communities were tight-knit, deeply distrustful of American police, and culturally conditioned to handle disputes privately. For the early Mafia, this was a perfect market. But protection money from corner grocers was never going to build an empire. What changed everything, what catapulted the American Mafia from neighborhood extortion rings to a national financial power, was a single constitutional amendment. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect, and suddenly the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol became illegal across the entire United States. Overnight, one of the largest consumer industries in the country went underground, and the men best equipped to run an underground industry were the ones who already lived there. If you find this kind of deep dive into the hidden mechanics of organized crime fascinating, consider subscribing. This channel is built for people who want to understand not just the headlines, but the systems underneath: the money, the logistics, the power structures that shaped history from the shadows. One click, and you're part of that exploration. Prohibition was a gold mine of almost incomprehensible proportions. The demand for alcohol didn't decrease when it became illegal. If anything, it intensified. And the Mafia was positioned to meet that demand with a vertically integrated supply chain that would have impressed any Fortune 500 executive. Let's trace the money. First, you needed product. Some was smuggled in from Canada or the Caribbean, rum-running operations that involved speedboats, bribed Coast Guard officers, and carefully mapped routes along the Atlantic seaboard. Bill McCoy, the famous rum runner, operated just outside U.S. territorial waters, selling cases of whiskey to smaller boats that would ferry the cargo ashore. But the Mafia didn't rely solely on smuggling. They manufactured their own product. Industrial alcohol, legally produced for chemical and medical use, was diverted, redistilled, and flavored basement distilleries operated in Brooklyn, Chicago, Detroit, and dozens of other cities, producing bathtub gin at staggering volume. The markup was extraordinary. A barrel of industrial alcohol cost roughly $5 to $10. Once redistilled and sold as drinkable liquor, it could generate several $100s in revenue. That is not a business model. That is an ATM. The distribution network was equally sophisticated. Speakeasies, illegal bars proliferated across American cities. New York alone had an estimated 32,000 of them by the late 1920s, more than double the number of legal bars that had existed before Prohibition. The Mafia didn't necessarily own all of them, but they supplied most of them, and they charged for more than just the liquor. They charged for protection. They charged for the privilege of operating in their territory. They arranged for corrupt police officers to look the other way, and they charged the speakeasy owner for that service too. Every layer of the operation generated revenue, and every dollar of that revenue was tax-free. There were no receipts. There were no shareholders demanding dividends. The profits were pure. This is where we need to zoom out and absorb a staggering number. Historians estimate that during Prohibition, organized crime in the United States generated annual revenues in the range of $3 to $5 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that's equivalent to roughly $50 to $80 billion today. To put that in context, in 1925, the entire federal budget of the United States was approximately $3 billion. The Mafia was operating a parallel economy of comparable scale, completely off the books, and the man who sat at the center of the largest single piece of that economy was Alphonse Gabriel Capone. Al Capone's Chicago operation during the late 1920s is probably the most famous criminal enterprise in American history, but what often gets lost in the mythology is the sheer financial sophistication of it. Capone didn't just sell booze, he controlled breweries, he owned distribution routes, he had interests in gambling parlors, brothels, and labor unions. His organization's estimated annual income was around $100 million in 1920s money. His headquarters at the Lexington Hotel was, in practice, a corporate office. He had accountants, he had lawyers, he had a public relations strategy, and critically, he had a money problem. Not a problem of too little money, a problem of too much. Cash was flooding in faster than it could be absorbed, and all of it was illegal. It had to be cleaned. It had to be made to look legitimate. And this is where the Mafia's relationship with money entered its most consequential phase. The term money laundering didn't enter common usage until much later, but the practice was perfected during Prohibition. The technique was conceptually simple. You take dirty cash, money earned from illegal activity, and you pass it through a legitimate business that deals primarily in cash transactions, making it impossible for authorities to distinguish between legal revenue and illegal revenue. Laundromats were one classic front, hence the name. But the Mafia used everything: restaurants, dry cleaners, vending machine companies, car washes. The key was volume plausibility. If you own a restaurant that seats 50 people, you can plausibly claim a certain amount of nightly revenue. You inflate that number by 20 or 30%, mix in the dirty cash, deposit it in a bank, and now it's clean. The IRS can't easily prove that your restaurant didn't actually serve that many customers. The genius of this system was its simplicity, and it remained the foundation of Mafia financial operations for the next 70 years. But Prohibition ended in 1933, and here is where the conventional story gets it wrong. Most people assume that when alcohol became legal again, the Mafia lost its primary source of income and had to scramble. The reality is precisely the opposite. Prohibition had given the Mafia something far more valuable than liquor profits. It had given them capital, infrastructure, political connections, and organizational discipline. They had spent 13 years building a national network, and now they simply redirected it. The post-Prohibition Mafia diversified with the cold efficiency of a private equity firm. Gambling became enormous. Illegal betting operations, numbers rackets, sports betting, backroom card games generated billions in the decades following repeal. The numbers racket alone, which was essentially an illegal lottery run in Black and Italian neighborhoods in cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit, was estimated to produce $300 million a year by the 1940s. The beauty of gambling from the Mafia's perspective was that the house always wins. Unlike selling a physical product, there was no cost of goods, no supply chain to protect, no perishable inventory. You simply provided the platform for people to lose money, and you kept a percentage. The overhead was minimal. The margins were obscene. Then there was loan sharking. This was arguably the Mafia's most elegant and most cruel financial operation. Here's how it worked. A person who couldn't get a loan from a bank because of bad credit, because they needed money for something they didn't want on record, or because they needed it immediately, would go to a Mafia-connected lender. The interest rates were predatory. 6% per week was common, sometimes compounding. A $1,000 loan could balloon into an unpayable debt within months. And when the borrower couldn't pay, the Mafia didn't write off the loss. They converted the debt into leverage. You can't pay? Fine. We own your business now, or we need you to do something for us. A trucking company owner who couldn't repay a loan might find himself hauling cargo he didn't want to ask about. A union official might find himself signing contracts with mafia-connected firms. Loan sharking wasn't just a revenue stream, it was a recruitment tool, a mechanism for expanding control into legitimate industries without ever having to buy anything at market price. And this brings us to what was arguably the most lucrative and least understood dimension of mafia wealth: labor racketeering. The mafia's infiltration of American labor unions, particularly in the construction, trucking, and garment industries, was so thorough that for decades it functioned as a hidden tax on the American economy. The mechanism worked like this. The mafia would gain control of a union local, either by installing a compliant president or by intimidating the existing leadership. Once they controlled the union, they controlled the labor supply. They could decide which companies got labor contracts and which didn't. They could call strikes against companies that refused to cooperate and ensure labor peace for companies that paid. They skimmed from pension funds. They awarded no-show jobs, positions where mafia associates collected paychecks without ever doing any work. They demanded kickbacks from contractors who wanted to bid on projects. Consider the concrete industry in New York City. By the 1970s and 1980s, the mafia, primarily through the Gambino and Genovese families, controlled the concrete workers' union and, through it, virtually every major construction project in Manhattan. The so-called Concrete Club was an arrangement in which a small number of mafia-connected concrete companies divided up all contracts worth more than $2 million. If you wanted to build a skyscraper in New York, you paid the mafia's price for concrete, or you didn't build. The markup was estimated at 15 to 20% above competitive market rates. That surcharge was, in effect, a private tax levied by organized crime on the physical growth of the nation's largest city. Some estimates suggest that mafia influence added hundreds of millions of dollars to construction costs in New York over a 20-year period. But the single most profitable and most destructive commodity the mafia ever traded was heroin. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. In the years after World War II, the American mafia, working in partnership with Corsican crime syndicates based in Marseille, France, built what became known as the French Connection, a transcontinental drug trafficking pipeline that moved morphine base from Turkey to processing labs in Marseille and then into the United States as refined heroin. The scale was enormous. By the 1960s, the French Connection was responsible for supplying an estimated 80% of the heroin consumed in the United States. The street value was incalculable. A kilogram of heroin purchased in Marseille for roughly $6,000 could be cut, repackaged, and sold on the streets of Harlem or the South Bronx for upwards of $1 million. Those margins, not 10%, not 50%, but 10,000% or more, were unlike anything in legal or illegal commerce. The man most closely associated with the American side of this operation was Salvatore "Lucky" Luciano, who, even after being deported to Italy in 1946, continued to orchestrate drug trafficking through intermediaries. Luciano's genius, if that word can be used for such devastation, was organizational. He treated heroin importation like a corporate logistics problem. He established redundant supply routes. He compartmentalized knowledge so that the arrest of any single participant couldn't unravel the network. He invested in political protection on both sides of the Atlantic, and the money flowed. Heroin profits in the 1950s and 1960s funded the expansion of mafia operations across the board, allowing families to invest in legitimate businesses, restaurants, real estate, waste management, casinos, that served both as money laundering vehicles and as sources of quasi-legal income. Here is a pattern interrupt worth absorbing. In 1963, a low-ranking mafia soldier named Joseph Valachi became the first member of the American Cosa Nostra to publicly acknowledge the organization's existence. Testifying before the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, chaired by Senator John McClellan, Valachi described the internal structure of the mafia in unprecedented detail: the 5 families of New York, the commission that mediated disputes between them, the rituals of initiation, and the code of omertà, the silence that held everything together. What struck investigators most was not the violence Valachi described, but the money. Valachi laid out in plain language how the mafia had embedded itself in the economic fabric of the country. It was not a gang. It was a government within a government, levying taxes, enforcing contracts, allocating resources, and settling disputes, all without any legal authority and entirely for profit. By the 1970s and 1980s, the mafia's financial operations had become so complex that they increasingly resembled white-collar crime. Skimming from Las Vegas casinos is a perfect example. The Mafia had invested in several major Las Vegas casinos, sometimes openly, sometimes through front men. The skim worked by diverting cash from the casino's counting rooms before it was officially recorded as revenue. Since casinos deal in enormous volumes of cash, this was relatively easy to conceal. The money was then transported, often literally in suitcases, to Mafia bosses in Kansas City, Chicago, and Milwaukee. The skim from just a few casinos, the Stardust, the Fremont, the Tropicana, was estimated at tens of millions of dollars over the course of a decade. The 1995 film Casino, while fictionalized, is based directly on these operations, and the real story was, if anything, more brazen than the movie depicted. The Mafia also moved aggressively into the waste management industry, particularly in the New York metropolitan area. Garbage collection is a perfect industry for organized crime. It is essential. It is local. It involves long-term contracts with municipalities and private clients, and it is cash-heavy. By the 1980s, Mafia-connected firms had divided up the waste hauling market in New York City into territories, creating a cartel that eliminated competition and kept prices artificially high. Businesses that tried to switch to a cheaper, non-Mafia-connected hauler found their garbage uncollected, their trucks vandalized, or worse. The New York Trade Waste Commission, established in 1996 specifically to break the Mafia's grip on the industry, estimated that organized crime's control of the garbage business had cost New York businesses an additional $400 million per year in inflated prices. The beginning of the end, or at least the beginning of serious attrition, came with two developments. The first was the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO, signed into law by President Richard Nixon in 1970, but not used effectively against the Mafia until the 1980s. RICO was revolutionary because it allowed federal prosecutors to charge the leaders of a criminal enterprise for crimes committed by their subordinates, as long as those crimes were part of an ongoing pattern of racketeering. Before RICO, Mafia bosses were virtually untouchable. They never handled drugs personally. They never pulled triggers. They gave orders through layers of intermediaries, and the link between the order and the act was nearly impossible to prove in court. RICO changed the calculus entirely. Now the boss could be held responsible for the pattern, for the enterprise itself. The second development was electronic surveillance. Throughout the 1980s, the FBI, under the direction of agents like the legendary Jules Bonavolunta, planted listening devices in Mafia social clubs, cars, and homes. The tapes captured Mafia bosses discussing murders, extortion, labor fraud, and drug deals in their own words. The intimacy of these recordings was devastating in court. Jurors heard Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family, casually discussing how to divide profits from a construction racket. They heard Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno of the Genovese family talking about controlling the concrete industry. The mystique of Omerta collapsed under the weight of the boss's own voices. The commission trial of 1986 was the culmination of these tools. Giuliani charged the bosses of all 5 New York families under RICO, arguing that the commission itself, the Mafia's governing body, was a criminal enterprise. The evidence was overwhelming: wiretaps, informant testimony, financial records painstakingly assembled by FBI forensic accountants. The convictions sent the leadership of the most powerful criminal organization in America to prison for 100-year sentences. But the Mafia didn't disappear. It adapted. Younger, less ostentatious leaders took over. They moved away from heroin, partly because the old dons had always viewed drug dealing as dangerous, and partly because the competition from Colombian and Mexican cartels was becoming ferocious. They doubled down on their traditional strengths: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and the infiltration of legitimate businesses. They became quieter, less violent, more corporate. And here lies perhaps the most unsettling truth about how the Mafia made its money. The fundamental business model never really changed. From the lemon groves of Palermo to the concrete yards of Manhattan, the Mafia's core competency was the same: the privatization of coercion. In a legitimate economy, the state holds a monopoly on force. It enforces contracts through courts. It regulates competition through antitrust law. It collects taxes through the IRS. The Mafia simply replicated these functions, privately for profit. It enforced contracts, its contracts through violence. It regulated competition by eliminating it. It collected taxes, its taxes through extortion. It was, in the most clinical sense, a parallel state, and it funded itself exactly the way a state does, by extracting rents from the population it controlled. The money was never really about the drugs or the gambling or the loan sharking individually. Those were just revenue lines. The money was about control, control of markets, control of labor, control of supply chains, and above all, control of information. The Mafia's greatest financial asset was always omerta, the silence. As long as no one talked, the books stayed closed, the relationships stayed hidden, and the money kept flowing. When that silence broke, when Valachi testified, when the wiretaps rolled, when turncoats like Sammy the Bull Gravano flipped and buried John Gotti with his testimony in 1992, the financial architecture became visible, and visibility is the one thing a shadow economy cannot survive. Today, the American Mafia still exists, but it is a fraction of what it was. Its estimated revenues have shrunk from billions to hundreds of millions. Its membership has declined. Its cultural cachet has faded. But the methods it pioneered, money laundering through cash businesses, the corruption of labor unions, the infiltration of legitimate industries, the use of shell companies and offshore accounts, these techniques did not disappear. They were adopted, refined, and scaled by criminal organizations around the world, from the Russian Bratva to the Mexican cartels to the Chinese triads. The Mafia didn't just make money, it wrote the playbook for how organized crime interfaces with legitimate capitalism, and that playbook is still in use. The final irony is this: the legal economy that the Mafia parasitized was itself built on many of the same principles: leverage, market control, information asymmetry, and the strategic use of power. The line between a Mafia boss skimming from a construction contract and a corporate executive engaging in price fixing is not as thick as we would like to believe. Both extract value not by creating something, but by controlling the terms under which others create. The difference, of course, is legality. But legality is a line drawn by the state, and the Mafia's entire existence was a reminder that the state's monopoly on that line is never as secure as it appears. Every dollar the Mafia ever made was earned in the gap between what the law demanded and what the market tolerated. That gap has never fully closed. It probably never will.